Okay, so I've just shared my screen, I hope. Yes?
Yep.
Excellent. Okay, well, I'm Craig Macadam. I am Conservation Director with Buglife, the Invertebrate Conservation Trust. And today I'm going to talk to you about mayflies, but as Craig said, I'm going to start off with just a little introduction to Buglife. So Buglife, as Craig said, Buglife is the only organisation in Europe concerned with the conservation of all invertebrates. Our aim is to halt invertebrate extinctions and to achieve sustainable populations of invertebrates in the UK. So we cover everything from mayflies to millipedes, spiders to starfish, you name it, we cover it. Anything without a backbone. And we do this in 4 main ways. We inspire others. We go out there, we show people invertebrates, we get them up close to invertebrates and show them what makes them tick. We shape policy, we influence decision makers to make the right choices for invertebrates to benefit them and their habitats. We undertake practical conservation efforts. So then, like this project, sorry, I've seen the timing on here, hold on. I'm just going to start that without timing again. Use timings. Yeah, so we undertake practical conservation efforts, which in this case, in the top left, top right there is a bog restoration project that we've been running in Falkirk and North Lanarkshire. And we raise awareness. We go out there and we talk to people and we tell them all about invertebrates and the issues affecting them. So this particular workshop feeds into our freshwater strategy. We published this last year or the year before, which has 8 main broad principles. And the 2 that this one feeds into is understanding, cherishing and properly valuing aquatic invertebrates and monitoring of freshwater invertebrates. So today I'm going to talk to you about mayflies. I'm going to do this presentation in 3 parts, and at the end of each part I'm going to allow a little bit of time for us to go through some of the questions in the chat. So the first part is going to be about just a general introduction to mayflies. Then I'm going to talk about the identification of mayfly larvae, and then the last part is going to be about recording riverflies, so recording mayflies, stoneflies and caddisflies. So mayflies are a fairly small order of insects. There's around about 3,200 species worldwide. There's a few new ones described every year. And in the UK, we've got 53 species. And for those of you that know your mayflies will know that for many, many years, there was only 51 species. But in the last 2 years, we've actually discovered 2 new species, and I'll come on to that later on. There are no endemic mayflies in the UK. In other groups we have some endemic species, some species that are only found in the UK, but in the mayflies they're all European species that have found their way here. Mayflies have a really ancient history. They're one of the oldest winged insects that we know. This is Mysthodotes obtusus, which is a fossil from around about 280 to 290 million years ago, which was found in fossil beds in Kansas. And you can see, if you look at that, you can see it looks very similar to a dragonfly. Actually, it's got long, large wings. Both sets of wings are large. The difference is that it's got these tails at the end here. And so this is 290 million years ago. If we come a little bit closer to present time, this is a piece of amber from Mexico from about 15 to 20 million years ago, and this is a species of mayfly here, which you can see it looks a lot more like a modern mayfly. It's got the large forewings and smaller hind wings here. This is actually a piece with a female here and a male here, and this is a full grid bug that's in the foreground there. And amber's amazing substance, because these insects have landed on a piece of resin on a tree and it's solidified with them in it, and they're preserved perfectly. You can see all the features. You can see on this detached leg here just all the features that you need to identify or to describe this species. The written history of mayflies is long as well. It goes back to around about 2000 BC, and this which is thought to be the first written text, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which describes a great ruler in ancient Babylonia, and he thinks he's immortal, and he thinks that he'll live forever, and they liken him to a mayfly, and with this quote here, which is, "Ever the river has risen and brought us the flood, the mayfly floating on the water. On the face of the sun its countenance gazes, then all of a sudden nothing is there." So it's talking about the brevity of life. It's talking about the brevity of the mayfly's life and the fact that it lives for a day and then it's gone.
Craig?
Yeah.
Craig, sorry, I'm just interrupting on behalf of quite a number of the audience. There's some comments and hands raised that the presentation you're going through isn't on the screen.
Oh, okay.
It is actually being shared. I think what I was just typing is I'm recommending that people log off and then rejoin the meeting. It's
Shall we start again then? I mean, we're only a couple of minutes into this, so shall we start again and try and get this to everybody can see it?
Well, I know that many people can see it. It seems to be a divide between I don't know how many people can't. There's certainly a few, but
okay.
We're getting messages coming through saying I can see it, and so
I will stop sharing.
I would recommend that anybody that hasn't been able to see the screen that Craig was sharing there logs out of the meeting and then tries to rejoin, because the screen was being shared. So it was visible for many of us.
I can't see the comments when I'm presenting, so okay. So leaving and joining's worked for people.
Yeah,
so
Sandra said leaving and rejoining has worked for her. So if anybody does have the problem that they can't see the screen, then I would recommend just leaving the meeting and then rejoining. Hopefully that will solve your issue.
Okay, so can people see it?
Sorry for the interruption, Craig.
No, that's fine. Can people see it now?
Yes, that's being shared.
I need to find my notes now. There we go. Okay, and I've got. Oh. Okay. Right. So yeah. So the Epic of Gilgamesh is the first, thought to be the first text with a reference to a mayfly in it. If we fast forward, nearly 4,000 years, we actually find the first scientific text with. No, I'm not moving around. Yeah, we find the first scientific text that names all Ephemeroptera as mayflies. This is the a monograph that was written by a minister from Cornwall, from Somerset, sorry, the Reverend Eaton. He is sort of the grandfather of mayfly research. He, at the time in 1883, he described every known species of mayfly, and he called them mayflies. And up to then, they'd been called Ephemeroptera, Ephemerons, Ephemeridae, but he was the first person to coin the phrase mayflies for them. And this book is still used. I've got a copy here, and I use it fairly regularly to check descriptions of species. It is a monumental piece of work. The descriptions of mayflies. This is a scientific description, but before Eaton, there were descriptions of mayflies, and they were mostly from people who were interested in angling. And one particular book which has some very, very detailed descriptions is this one here. It's the Book of St Albans, which was created by a clergy person, Dame Juliana Berners, who was the abbess of, I've forgotten which abbey she was with, but and this was in 1486. And she made quite detailed descriptions of how you fish. So she had a treatise of fishing with an angle. So one of the first mentions of angling, and she described the tackle, she described the methods, but she also described the flies that you should use. And she gave patterns for mimicking them. So this one here, the dun fly, was the body of dun wool and the wings of the partridge. And that's believed to be either Rithregina germanica or Ecdioneris tarentus. She described the yellow fly for May, the body of yellow wool, the wings of red cock hackle, and of the drake dyed yellow. And you can see here, this is Heptagenia sulphurea, which we now call the yellow May dun. It emerges in May, and it's got this reddish colouring round about the base of these yellow wings and yellow body. And then she called in June, the dun cut, the body of black wool, a yellow stripe along either side, the wings of the buzzard bound on with hemp that's been treated with tan bark. And this is a really good description of Electrogena lateralis with this yellow stripe down the side underneath the wings here. And we still call it the dusky yellow streak now. Okay, so that's kind of the history of mayflies as a thing. Let's have a look at their life history now. They start off as an egg, and the female insect is simply an egg carrier. It carries the eggs to the river for laying. And you can see this image here of a small canis adult with the abdomen actually packed full of eggs. And mayflies can lay anything between 2,000 to 8,000 eggs, the species in the UK. So they're basically just egg factories, if you like, the females. The eggs, when they hit the water, they need to prevent them from washing away, so they have a form of sticky attachment structures. In many species, this is just the sticky surface of the eggs themselves. But in others, as these ones here, they are very distinctive, and they can even be used to identify the species to the species level. These fine hairs on the side of the eggs spring out on contact with water and enable the eggs to stick to plants and gravel and the bed, etc. Some species go a step further, and they actually crawl under the water to lay their eggs directly onto stones to prevent them from washing away. And this is a Batis rhodani egg patch here. You can see all these little tiny patches are actually patches of eggs that a female has laid on an exposed stone. She's landed on an exposed stone in the river, crawled under the water surface, and then laid the eggs directly. And you can see that each patch has hundreds upon hundreds of eggs in them. The egg develops through time and is linked with temperature. It starts off as a fairly featureless object. You can then, through time, you can see it change inside. You can see the larvae developing. You can just about see the shape moving there. You can start to see the body segments in the bottom of this image here. You see the eye spots now. And then you see it'll hatch out. And when it hatches out, it looks a little like a silverfish. The things to note are that in this case there are no gills down the side of the body when in this first instar larvae. Different species go through different egg development stages. So in that one that I've just shown you, which was Ephemera danica, the egg is laid and the egg starts developing straight away, and it develops all the way through and hatches without stopping. The one on the bottom here is the blue-winged olive Ceratella ignita, and this does the same thing. It develops all the way through, and then it stops, and it stops just before the winter in this case. So it will lay its eggs in between July and September. It will develop fairly quickly, and then it goes into this thing called diapause. And this is effectively a suspended animation stage where it stops all development. It stops any development at all, and it waits. And in this case, it waits over the winter, and then its development is then triggered again when the water temperature rises in the spring. So this is just basically a method for it to avoid any harm during the winter. You can see on the image here, you can see the attachment feature on this one. So these eggs are stuck to the bed, developing away, and then waiting for the warmer weather in the winter, in the spring, sorry, to allow it to hatch. Interestingly, some populations of this species have forgone the diapause and will develop all the way through, particularly in warmer temperatures. So, and we're starting to see that in the chalk streams of the south of England, where we're getting populations of Ceratella ignita going right the way through without diapause, and that is almost certainly a response to climate change. When they've hatched out, that little nymph that I showed you there is pretty vulnerable to being mashed about and or taken by other insects. So what they do is they go down into the gravels. And when we think of a river, we think of that sort of meandering stream on the surface of the land, but actually the river is much bigger than that. It's got a large area called the hypereic area, which is the water is where water is underneath the river in the surrounding land and in the surrounding gravels. And on this image here, you can see how the water enters gravel and will appear elsewhere. And it's in this sort of flow here that you'll find a lot of those small first instar larvae. We did some sampling where we put in tubes and sucked out the water from this area about 1 meter down. And you think you've got nothing, and then when you start looking under the microscope, you've got all these tiny mayfly and stonefly larvae. And if you put them in a tube, you would think there's nothing in there, but you shake it and you get this sort of like snow globe effect with all these tiny hundreds upon hundreds of these tiny larvae. Now this slide's titled Nymphs. I've not changed this. Just before we go any further, nymphs and larvae are kind of the same thing. The accepted term now is larvae for all aquatic juvenile aquatic insects, but I still lapse into saying nymphs every so often. Nymphs used to be the term that was used for things that didn't go through full metamorphosis, so things like mayflies and stoneflies, whereas caddisflies, which do go through full metamorphosis, were larvae. Now we just call them all larvae, although I've not changed this slide. The larvae come in various shapes and sizes, but they all have there's probably two main body plans, if you like. There's the streamlined cylindrical shape like this here, with the 3 tails here and external gills down the side. You can see that the antennae are quite long here, and you've got the 3 pairs of legs as you would have on all insects. You can actually see here the developing wing pads as well. So this is a fairly mature larvae. The wing pads are this is holding the wings in here, and as they mature, these grow and they darken. So once these if these was to go black, you would think that this was going to emerge in the next couple of days. The other main body form that we have in the UK is the flattened nymph, the sort of like very streamlined. These are the Heptagenidae. They live in really fast flowing water and they're superbly streamlined. They've done various work on these species to look at just how effective they are at reducing drag and keeping themselves on the water. And this is some of the information out of the papers, and they have used this sort of the design of these nymphs, if you like, to design Formula 1 cars. They've looked at how effective these are at keeping themselves on the ground, on the bed. Some of them have, if I go back to this one, you can see some of these have quite a lot of adaptations. This one has actually got a big bulge on its pronotum, which is a flattened area at the side, which allows the water to push down on it. It's got this broad flattened head which slopes back the way, so again it can put that into the current and the water will go straight over it. These big powerful legs which are angled backwards so that the water again doesn't catch it. And then in the Riftagina, they've got their gills are actually interlinked and overlapped down the side, so it creates a skirt which allows them to get even more downforce onto the bed. They're actually really difficult to get off of a tray or a stone if you find one. And that comes to a point that in all aquatic insects, it's not about the flow, it's about the velocity, it's about how fast the flow is going. And these are just some graphs, some work that was done in Europe, looking at shear stress, at how much flow there could be before an insect popped off a rock or whatever. And you can see there's quite a difference. The one I showed you there was Ecdioneus venosus, and you can see that it's a fairly medium in its requirements, whereas Ruthogenus semicolorata, that one with the skirt of gills round it, it can just hold on and hold on and hold on right off the end of the scale. And then you can see other ones here like Amyletus sinopinatus, which is clearly doesn't like flow at all. It doesn't like fast flows at all, and it prefers. And this one you find in typically in pools in rivers. So it's very much about what's happening in the river, and that can dictate not just which lengths of river you find these species in, but also the individual parts of that length. So it could be that you find some just behind the larger stones where there's a little bit less flow, less velocity, or you might find them in the very fast riffly bits because they prefer that. As with all insects, the strength of the insect body is in the exoskeleton, and for them to grow, they've got to get rid of that exoskeleton. And mayflies need to do this just the same as any others. But mayflies do it an awful lot of times. They can be up to 50 instars in some mayflies. So they're through that annual life cycle, they're shedding their skin maybe 50 times, which is a lot. And when they shed their skin, this is an example of Ephemera danica shedding its skin, and you can see that the freshly emerged next instar is it's actually quite soft because that exoskeleton, that hard outer layer, hasn't hardened yet. So it's fairly vulnerable at this time. And to put all that energy into developing the exoskeleton, and to do that maybe up to 50 times, there's a lot of effort goes into that. They don't feed either when they're molting. So once they've got to the stage where they need to molt, they'll stop feeding and they'll shed the skin. And you'll often find if you're kick sampling or collecting in any other way, you'll often find these shed skins, particularly around when there's been a hatch as well. I'm going to show you some one or two species now. This is a species that is relatively uncommon in the UK. This is Amyletus sinopinatus. It's found in upland areas. It's called the upland summer mayfly, and it's found in Wales and Snowdonia, in the Pennines, the Peak District, and throughout Scotland. It lives in particularly harsh environments, so it lives well up in the hills, often where there's a lot of cold weather. In this particular, I'm going to show you a site that we've sampled a lot. This is up at the top end of Glen Shee. This is where it lives. It lives in this little stream. This is just as the stream's drying in the summer, so it started to pool, and there's not much flow in it. The mayfly at this stage is in its egg form and down in the gravels. In the winter, there's not much flow either because the thing freezes or over, and the flow actually stops as well. If you remember back to the slide about velocity, Amyletus sinopinatus doesn't mind that. It doesn't mind living in a pool. In this case, it's living under the ice. And the reason that this is one of my sampling sites is kind of a fairly lazy entomologist, and there is a large car park next to it for the ski centre. Unfortunately, my sampling point that I chose to begin with is underneath that white van, because they've put the car park, they've extended the car park over the stream, and that causes a problem. There are some problems with pollution later in the spring when the ice is melting, and but generally speaking, this parts of this system up here are pristine. They've never changed. Temperature is the key thing for Amylotis and Opanatus. And what we've been looking at is how its growth is affected by temperature. And what's really interesting at this site here is this is a graph of air temperature versus water temperature round about that area. So the air temperature at the ski centre and water temperature in the stream. And when we get to the period of snow cover, the water temperature just levels off because it's insulated. The stream's insulated, and the water temperature is actually really constant over that period, despite air temperature going down to -9 or something there and going up. The water temperature just stays the same. And you can see here as we go further on during the year, you've got this period here when the air temperature and the water temperature are the same, and that's when the river the stream had dried out and the logger had been exposed. So Amylotis is present in this stream from around about the end of September, so around about here. So this is the growing period, and it's got to get out before it dries up. The temperature, we looked at various points in the catchment and the temperature and what the difference was in the temperature. And what we found was that during the coldest parts of the year, the site at the highest altitude, the one that was covered with snow all the time, was actually the warmest site in terms of water temperature. And that meant that Amylotis and Opanatus could actually develop relatively consistently right the way through and emerge at the same time as the rest of the population in that stream, which was quite interesting. What is particularly worrying, though, is when you start looking at climate change and what may happen to temperatures in Europe over the next sort of 50 years or so, you start to see that there's going to be a big pressure on these species that are living at high altitude. This is a piece of work that was done by Taubman et al. In 2011, and it looked at current temperature, current climate conditions and projected climate conditions, and looked at what the distribution of Amylotis and Opanatus may be under those projections. And you can see what this is the current at the top here, and there's a strong populations in Scandinavia and in Scotland and the areas that I mentioned, and also in Central Europe. But by 2080, it's predicted that it will be lost from much of Central Europe. We'll still have populations in Scandinavia and Scotland. It will be lost from much of England and Wales, and just in the Alps in Central Europe. So this species is right on the edge. It really needs help if it's going to survive in some of these areas. One thing that we can do for this species is we can plant some trees along the river. We can, as long as we get them high enough up the catchment, they can help to cool the water by shading it. This is a piece of work that was done actually for power mussels rather than Amylotis in the River Mick up in the Scottish Highlands. And these little patches of trees will grow and provide some shade for the river. But we need to have the right tree in the right place and make sure that winter sunshine still gets to the river in the places where it's needed, because that can be important for the development of other stoneflies and mayflies. And we are working with University of Aberdeen to look at just exactly how we target those patches. We know which stretches need the trees, but where do we put them? And this is actually a piece of an image from a drone with a thermal camera on it, and it can show you where the cold patches and warm patches of the river are. So we can see here this blue patch here is probably a groundwater upwelling. There's a tributary coming in here that's providing some colder water. But along this bank here, there's big yellow patches where if we were able to put some trees round about here in this area, we might be able to cool that patch there. So once they've gone through the going back onto the life cycle, once they've gone through their nymph or larval stage, they need to get out of the water. These are aquatic insects. They need to get out of the water to take to the air to become adults, and they will. Most of them emerge at the surface of the water. So what will happen is that the larvae will it'll go down to the bed of the river or pond or lake, and it will do a couple of practice runs. It'll swim up to the surface, hang there for a bit, and then swim back down. And it'll do that a couple of times, and it's probably just checking out conditions at that stage. When it's ready to go, it will swim up to the surface, and as it hits the surface, the back of the thorax splits open, and the adult inside is covered in tiny little hairs, and these hairs are repel water, and they open up a little window that allows the adult to crawl out. As you can see in this image here, this is a Batis larvae that has got up to the surface. It's cracked open its back of its thorax, and it's now just pulling itself out onto the surface of the water. And when they do this, they can do this in huge numbers. We trapped at Windermere in the Lake District one year, and we were actually looking for caddisflies, and we were conscious of this sort of mist or this smoke coming across Windermere, and then it hit the trap, and it was a swarm of Canis mayflies. And you see here there were just hundreds of them, and there were some midges in there as well, but the majority of them were these little Canis mayflies. And that was a big hatch, and it's one you kind of could predict from there. But there are some huge hatches in the world, and so big that you can actually pick them up on weather radar. This is a little sequence from Lake St. Clair over in the States. And this is the start of a hatch. These little pink pixels there, and these are 10-minute intervals. These animations. So we start to see the hatch build and build. And that's after 30 minutes, 40 minutes, and then there at that point there, you see those two intense points, the two pink points. That is the mating swarm. So that's where the males and the females have come together, and they're in these massive mating swarms. And then an hour later in the sequence of data, all the females are back on the lake laying their eggs. So you can actually track the life cycle of these insects using, remotely using weather data. There's such a large hatch, and that's what it sort of looks like. I mean, it is phenomenal. They are attracted to lights. They cover surfaces. This is actually from the Mississippi. This is Hexagenia limbata, and the massive hatches in the lower Mississippi. That's another piece of weather data there from 2003, which is a particularly big hatch on the Mississippi. And they have a service, the US Met Office, if you like, have a service that allows you to track these hatches, and that's just an animation from La Crosse in Wisconsin of the hatch. It's not just the US, and we also have these hatches in Europe. This is Ephron Virgo, and you can see there's warning signs put up because these things are pretty slippy when they're on the road. You get the drift of mayflies on the road, and certainly they're in decline in Europe, and we don't get them in the UK, but it's quite an amazing sight to see. We do get large hatches in the UK. We get early on in the season, Rithogena germanica can have large hatches particularly on the River Tweed, but on some other rivers as well. And in the chalk streams, we can have quite large hatches of Ephemera danica in some areas. Once they've emerged, mayflies are unique as insects in having two adult stages. So most insects emerge from the larvae or the pupa, and then that's it, they're an adult. In mayflies, they've got another resting stage, if you like, called the subimago. And this looks like an adult, but technically it's actually still a last instar larva, because it's not sexually mature and it's not its final stage. This is a Potamanthus luteus subimago. You can see that the wings are opaque, the body is coloured, the tails are relatively short, and the legs are relatively short. This is a male here. We can just about see the developing genitalia, the forceps here. And this now needs to go off and it needs to molt again. So this will go off to the side of the river. It will find a piece of vegetation or some other substrate for it to sit on, and it will molt again. And it does this. There's another little sequence here. This time of a Batis nymph, a Batis subimago, and it will kind of do the same process as it did as a larva. It will flatten down its wings, crack open the thorax, and then crawl out. And this is just a little sequence that shows that. So there's the wings going down. At this point, the larvae, the thorax is splitting, and the full adult, the imago, is crawling out from that subimago skin. And it really is as quick as that. So they can't hang about once they've decided they're going to do this. When they do this, you know, this is now them fully mature. You will find these little shucks, these little cast skins left on leaves and things like that. But this is the end point. This is what he's trying to achieve as a species. Just again, this is an example there. Some species do this very quickly after emerging as the nymph. The most will go off and rest for a wee while, maybe a couple of hours or even overnight, and then will emerge in the morning. In the Canis, they often do it just as they are emerging from the river. I've actually seen them crawling up my chest waders, crawling up the leg of the chest waders, and as they're doing it, they're emerging into the imago. So they're coming out of the water as a subimago, and then just crawling up and becoming the imago before it gets up to the top of the waders. So this is the same individual we saw earlier on as the subimago. This is the imago, and you can see the legs are much longer, and the tails are much longer. The tails are longer to allow it to stabilize itself in flight. The legs are longer because this is a male, and when they go and try and find a female, what will happen is that the male will go off and it will swarm. It will create a sort of a lek or a swarm where it, what they do is they flap their wings to go up in the swarm and then float down, and they do this sort of a circular motion. All the time they're looking for a female to come into that swarm, and you can see that the eyes on this individual are large and up, pointing up the way, and that's because the female will come in above this in the swarm, and then the male will actually put these long legs right over the top of her wings and immobilize her to stop her from flying, and then they'll couple then mate and fall out of the swarm. And as they fall out, by the time that they reach the ground, the female has been fertilized and the eggs have been fertilized, and the male is dying at that point. It won't survive much longer after that, and sometimes they'll fall straight out into the river. The other thing to see on this is that the body is now clear apart from the wing muscle at this end here to power the wings and the sperm packet that it's going to pass on to the female. The wings are clear, they're no longer opaque. And the reason they were opaque before is because there was this other set of wings inside them. So it was basically a double layer of wings. So those are the main differences between the subimago and the imago. And there's just an example of ephemera lineata with the subimago with the more muted colours, and these are the females, just to show you. In the female, the colour remains in the body because the body is full of eggs, so it's not clear as in the male. You can see it doesn't have quite as long legs because it doesn't need those, or large eyes. Okay, so that is a really whistle-stop tour through the life cycles and various other bits and pieces about mayflies. I'm going to stop there and see if anybody's got any questions before we move on to some information about identifying mayfly larvae.
Brilliant. Thanks, Craig. We had one question earlier on when we were talking about the eggs and females from Brian Shaw. I'm not sure if it's a cipher. Can you see the conversation?
Hold on, I'll just get it.
In the meeting chat. Wait, one baited egg per patch a female? One baited patch per female?
Yes, mostly. Some of the bigger ones will will do other ones. They tend to lay their eggs and then they get washed off. So Betis adults will lay somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 eggs. So so they will have several patches. I'm just trying to find the chat. Yeah, and they will. You do find on some of these rocks. You'll find after one set of larvae have hatched out, eggs will be laid on top of that. So there'll be a continual sort of like laying of eggs, particularly if there's not many exposed rocks in the stream.
Okay. A question from Jane Ackerman. Do we know why they go through so many instars compared to other insects?
I think it's probably the rapid growth. They are growing. They've got a fairly limited time to grow. The species that are going through a lot of instars are having to grow in maybe 2 or 3 months' time. So they've got to basically change their skin quickly to get to the size that they need to emerge. I see the next question. How do the front legs lengthen so quickly? So that is a really good question, and I don't know the answer to that. I'm not aware of much research on the physiological changes in the subimago and to the imago stage. But it is interesting because there is a massive change in size, and there's not much. It's not as if they're going through a pupal stage that allows them to reconstitute their sort of like body shape. No, I don't know the answer to that. Will some species benefit from increasing temperatures? Yes, indeed. So there are moves in a lot of aquatic insect groups. So dragonflies in particular are because they're quite good dispersers. They can move on that advancing front of warm temperature, and we're seeing that in mayflies as well. So there's a species called Ephemerella notata, which is becoming more common in northern areas. I've found it in the River Don, for instance, in Aberdeen, and fairly regularly in the River Don, which it used to be occasional, but it seems to be. It was first recorded in Scotland, I think, in the 70s or 80s in the River Endrick, and the fact that it's now further north would suggest that it is moving on that climate front. Where are we now? Do number of instars depend on water temperature and feed?
Or is it a species specific thing?
It's a good question. So it is very much species dependent, but I'm guessing there will be some variation in the number of instars, but not a massive sort of like between 10 and 50. Maybe a 1 or 2 instars. They might emerge earlier. Would they? I don't know, actually. It's a good question. Not going to answer that one either. What is the lifespan of females? As you said, the male dies not long after fertilization of the female. Okay, so most of them will go will fly off from the mating swarm after mating, and they will go and find a place to lay eggs, and then that's them. That they'll be spent and they'll die then. But one particular species, Cloion dipterum, is it will actually fly off with its eggs fertilized, and it'll actually gestate them. So it keeps those eggs in its body for about a week, and then lays its eggs. And when the eggs touch the water, they hatch immediately as larvae and swim off. So that one's got a particular technique there for egg laying. In fact, it doesn't actually, it lays its eggs, but they're immediately larvae. And that it's actually one of the most successful mayflies in the world. It's colonized, I think, all continents apart from Antarctica. And that's probably because it can carry these eggs with it. The other thing I didn't say is that some females can develop, some mayflies can develop without male fertilization, so parthenogenetically. So there's about 19, I think it's 19 species in the UK that can do that out of the 53, which is another way that they can make sure that they continue. I mean, they've been doing this for 300 odd million years. You know, they're pretty good at this. Kenny, yeah, it is. I think it is a species-specific thing, but there will be some variation around that. With the map showing species distribution, there's no data for Northern Ireland, so they're not there, and if so, why? Or is it a lack of data? So I run the Mayfly recording scheme, but that only covers Great Britain. It doesn't cover Ireland. There's the National Biodiversity Data Centre covers Ireland, and CEDAR in Northern Ireland. So I've not got data, but Amyletus is present in Northern Ireland. It's actually endangered there. They've classified it as endangered because there's so few populations and it's declining so quickly for the same issues. They've not got high enough mountains. How quickly do they adapt to environmental changes like climate change? If you mean by adapt to how quickly are they affected by it, we're seeing Amyletus move upstream fairly quickly, or be lost from lower altitudes fairly quickly. So we did a project where we resurveyed sites where Amyletus was present at lower altitudes, and almost all of them, this was maybe 20 years, records from 20 years ago, and almost all of them had lost their Amyletus. So yeah, they are affected by climate change quite quickly, and certainly other environmental changes like pollution can affect them immediately. If there's a pollution incident, they can be wiped out. Is the life cycle annual in all mayflies? Okay, so in the UK, most have got an annual life cycle, one year life cycle. Some will have multiple generations in a year, so that some of the Batis will have up to 3 generations. The larger ones, the ephemera species, typically have a 2-year life cycle, so they'll have 2 years to develop. And then in other parts of the world, you can have I'm racking my brains. I think there's a species that's is maybe 3 years, but most are an annual life cycle. There are some species in the world that have very quick life cycles as well. What's the evolutionary advantage of having 2 winged adult phases? Well, if anybody knows, that'd be great. You could let me know. I don't. There's a lot of debates. It clearly seems to be some sort of like hangover. That perhaps this is the ancient form. With them being such a long lineage of species. Certainly, there does seem to be, as we've mentioned earlier, there does seem to be a lot of development goes on in that extra stage, which allows them to. It's perhaps because they can't go from the stage of having all those features present in the nymph and then come out as a fully formed adult. Some I think there is one or two species that have almost forgone that stage, and I'm trying to think. There is a species that's forgone that stage and doesn't, and just comes out and just gets on with it. But it's probably to do with morphological change. What is the definition of a mayfly? Oh, right. I should have said this at the start. So mayfly are different things to different people. So the word mayfly is used, as we saw, Eaton used it to describe all Ephemeroptera. In the south of England, mayfly is the three ephemera species, so Ephemera danica, lineata, and vulgata. In a lot of areas, they'll call the rest of them upwing flies, which I think is a bit clumsy and pretty not very nice. Doesn't fit them really. They used to be called dayflies because of their short life cycle, or their short adult life cycle. If you were to talk about a mayfly up in Caithness, they would be talking about a stonefly. So that's kind of why we tend to use the Latin or the scientific name, the Ephemeroptera, when we're trying to make sure what we're talking about. It's a good question, and it's one that causes lots of arguments in a pub, if we ever get to go to a pub again. Are the size of local populations cyclic, and if so, what periods? Possibly, sometimes. Some species do go in a sort of like boom and bust. There's a lot in that question. It can depend a lot on environmental conditions. It can depend on in rivers, it can depend about water quality. It can depend on temperature. We have got the North Atlantic Oscillation has been shown to affect populations of various freshwater invertebrates, and certainly I've seen presentations on fish that shows a 7-year cycle in population size or in catches at least. So yeah, there is probably something, but I wouldn't like to say what the period is on that. And I'm not sure what.
No, I'm not sure what Aidan's referring to. And southern, is it present? Maybe she can elaborate.
I think Hughes answered the question. There's no Amylitis in Northern Ireland. It's in the Republic, so Southern Ireland. Yeah.
There we go.
Ephemera danica, can development to the imago stage be actively delayed or postponed during? No. Well, I think Ken Whelan in Ireland has a paper which showed that they emerge anyway, and they emerged in a really bad summer storm one year, and their reproductive success was really poor, and that you can still you can probably still see the impact of that poor emergence in the population structure just now, because they're a 2-year. You can see the difference between them. If they were a 1-year life cycle, they would, if they emerge at the wrong time, that's it, gone. What factor triggers nymphs to hatch? So the preceding weather, so temperature is one thing. So the two different approaches. So the early season emergers will, it's pretty much on day length. So you'll find they're hatching at the same time all year round, because they're not really bothered about temperature if it's early season. So Rithogena germanica on different rivers has a day when you can pretty much expect the hatch to start. I think the River Tweed is about April the 15th, from memory. But the other type of trigger is that's on temperature, and on the actual day, it can be to do with brightness. So they're looking for good weather, and depending on what the temperature has been in the day before and what the temperature is on the day, that can determine what time of day they actually emerge. Whether if it's been a very warm day before and a warm evening, you might find them hatching earlier in the morning, whereas if it's been a cooler evening, they might hatch later in the day. So there's subtle sort of differences in the triggers, but the main ones are either day length or temperature. I think that's it.
Yeah, I think that's it. Hugh was just making a point about the Amyletus.
Yeah.
In Ireland.
Yeah. Okay, well, what I'll do now is I'll move on to the identification. Oh, last minute question. Can increased shade from riparian planting then affect hatching? And possibly, but at least they're still there to be able to hatch. I suppose. I think there are some species. It's interesting that there are species that Heptogenus sulphurea, anecdotally, they don't like hatching where there's any shade. They'll hatch into direct sunlight, and then they'll fly straight up to the top of the trees. So potentially there's an impact there. I think the key with riparian planting, though, is that we shouldn't be making dark corridors. You know, it is all about dappled light. It's about little patches here and there to you know, it's not about covering the whole of the banks in trees, because some species do need some light in there, particularly in the winter. And you know, we should be making sure that we're having deciduous trees and not conifers, so that we are getting winter sunlight, because that's what drives some of these upland ecosystems, that winter sunlight, particularly for species, particularly for stoneflies, which need some algae to feed on.